When we hear the word Vikings, our minds immediately conjure up the same Hollywood image. Bearded men in horned helmets leap from ships, shout something incoherent, and start hacking everyone to pieces with axes. It sounds dramatic, but it's only a tiny part of the real historical picture. The true strength of these northern people lay in a completely different art. Their main weapons were not swords, but trading scales and incredible physical endurance. The Viking Age is the period from the 8th to the 11th century, when the Scandinavians suddenly decided to see what lay beyond the horizon. Most movies portray them as mere raiders who simply got lucky finding the weak spots of medieval Europe. Imagine the logistics of modern-day Amazon, only without the internet, without airplanes, and without satellite navigation. The Vikings managed to deliver exotic goods across thousands of kilometers of completely hostile territory. Walrus bone was shipped to Byzantium, Baltic amber ended up in the Middle East, and furs were sent to Kiev. Their ships were true technological marvels of their time, changing the rules of the game on the water. We're used to thinking that cutting-edge technology means microchips, smartphones, or neural networks. For the Scandinavians of the 8th century, cutting-edge technology was the drakkar, which could sail both across the ocean and up shallow rivers. The secret lay in the unique design of the hull, which literally flexed with the waves rather than breaking under impact. Modern engineers still marvel at this flexibility, calling it a genius solution. The Vikings simply took an axe, a piece of oak, and built the transport of the future without blueprints. In this video, we'll follow in their footsteps and see exactly what they carried in their holds. We'll take a detailed look at the goods that cost a fortune and transformed the economies of entire nations. You'll learn why a piece of walrus tusk could easily buy you a stone house in Constantinople. We'll talk about slaves, furs, and amber, the solid foundation of the northern global economy. This is a harsh trade route that isn't shown in movies, but it was precisely this route that shaped that era. Fasten your seatbelts. We're heading back to the cold 8th century. The Vikings would never have built their empire without the right, innovative transportation. Their ships are a distinct art form that was centuries ahead of its time. Drakkars are often portrayed in movies as huge, fearsome vessels with aggressive dragon heads, but for large-scale trade, they used a completely different type of ship called a nor. This ship was wider, deeper, and could carry up to 40 tons of valuable cargo. Imagine a modern truck that can sail across the ocean and park right on a sandy beach. The nor didn't need deep water ports or complex docks for quick unloading. Thanks to its flat bottom, the Vikings could approach any shallow shore and start trading immediately. This may sound like a simple detail, but it was precisely this feature that gave them a massive advantage over other peoples. They didn't have to pay port fees or wait weeks in line to unload. They simply landed where there was demand and instantly began doing business. The construction technology of these ships defies all modern, strict engineering rules. Instead of using a rigid internal frame, Scandinavian craftsmen assembled the hull from flexible oak planks. The planks were laid overlapping and fastened with iron rivets, which gave the entire structure incredible flexibility. When a modern, rigid ship crashes into a large wave, it absorbs the full force of the impact. A Viking ship simply bent with the churning water, gliding over it like a giant snake. Modern engineers could not believe for a long time that such a rickety structure was even capable of crossing the ocean. At the end of the 19th century, a group of daredevils built an exact replica of a drakkar and set sail for America in it. They proved that these ships not only don't sink, but also reach astonishing speeds on the open sea. The flexible hull literally absorbed the destructive energy of the waves, turning a storm into a sort of elastic trampoline. It's like the difference between riding in a creaky cart without springs and a modern, comfortable SUV. The Vikings invented marine adaptive suspension 1,000 years before the first cars appeared. But this cutting-edge technology had one huge problem that required grueling physical labor. The Nor, loaded to the brim with goods, was incredibly heavy, and diesel engines hadn't been invented yet. The main source of propulsion remained a huge square sail, hand-woven from coarse sheep's wool. If the wind suddenly died down or blew in the wrong direction, the merchants had to take up the heavy oars. Rowing a loaded vessel against the current of a turbulent river is a form of torture that makes every muscle ache. And this is where it gets truly interesting when you consider their Spartan living conditions. There were absolutely no cabins, soft hammocks, or even the simplest shelters from the pouring rain on board. They slept right on the hard deck, huddling under animal skins or that very same giant woolen sail. Food was prepared only during rare stops ashore because lighting a fire on a wooden ship was suicide. They ate mainly fresh dried fish and hard bread, washing it down with murky, sour beer. A modern labor safety inspection would have shut down such a dubious business on the very first day. However, it was precisely this harsh, unforgiving reality that shaped the character of the ideal medieval merchant. Physical endurance was far more important than the ability to speak eloquently or haggle at an Eastern bazaar. If you couldn't endure a week of an icy storm on the open deck, you simply wouldn't make it to the market. The Scandinavians viewed the unpredictable sea not as an obstacle, but as a high-speed highway. The water did not divide their small world. It connected it into a single global commercial network. With such an ideal, proven mode of transport, all the Vikings had to do was find the right goods to sell. And they quickly realized that Europe and Asia were desperately craving things they didn't have. The empires of the South didn't need ordinary wooden trinkets or iron swords. They had plenty of their own. They wanted luxury, high status, and exotic goods, for which they were willing to pay with fine silver. The North could offer them unique goods that were considered true wonders in Constantinople or Baghdad. And first on this exclusive list was the gold of the Arctic ice. When we think of ancient luxury, diamonds, gold, or fine silk usually come to mind. But in the Middle Ages, one of the most expensive materials on the planet was high-quality bone. Ivory had always been highly prized, but the traditional route from Africa to Europe was blocked by constant wars. The Byzantine elite desperately needed a reliable material for creating carved boxes, chess sets, and religious ornaments. And that's when enterprising Vikings entered the scene with their unique and very timely northern offering. The solution to this pressing problem was the walrus, which was abundant off the coasts of Greenland and Iceland. The tusks of these huge, clumsy animals were in no way inferior to ivory in terms of strength and beauty. They were carved into objects of stunning detail that adorned the palaces of emperors and the chambers of wealthy bishops. The process of obtaining this material was a true nightmare, requiring incredible physical strength and bravery. Imagine attacking a 1.5-ton beast with a regular spear, a beast that could easily crush your boat. This was no office job with set hours. It was a deadly battle for every hard-earned penny. The hunt for these giants took place far to the north, in the harsh and dangerous icy waters. The Vikings established remote settlements in Greenland, largely for the sake of this lucrative bone trade. They loaded the harvested tusks onto their Nors and set off on an incredibly long journey south. The journey from Greenland to the resplendent Constantinople took many months and required crossing several seas. But the final profit from the sale of walrus ivory more than covered absolutely every conceivable risk. It is interesting to wonder how the distant Greenlandic Vikings paid their mandatory taxes to the Catholic Church. There
The
was
heft of it is
absolutely
good,
no point in sending
and the
dried
grain
cod or
holds
live
true.
livestock to the
Yes.
Vatican. Therefore, the sacred tax was paid in walrus tusks,
I swear
which were
I
then
will,
sold
chieftain.
at a profit throughout Europe. However, this lucrative business also had a
move now.
deeply dark ecological side. Massive, uncontrolled hunting led to the complete destruction of the walrus population in Iceland. Hunters had to venture farther and farther into the dangerous north, risking being trapped in the ice forever. Ultimately, the thriving Greenlandic colonies began to decline precisely because of climate change. When the ice finally froze, the sea solid, transporting the main export commodity became physically impossible. Walrus bone taught medieval Europe a very important lesson the hard way. The most valuable and coveted resources are often found in the most inaccessible and dangerous places on the planet. The Vikings built their early, powerful economy on blood and ice, selling luxury goods to the warm south. They charted routes that seemed utterly impossible given the primitive state of technology at the time. But this was just one of the exotic goods they offered to the wider world. On the cold shores of the Baltic, another treasure awaited them, poetically called the Tears of the Gods. If walrus ivory was the durable plastic of the Middle Ages, then amber was its neon light. For millennia, this fossilized resin from ancient trees has captivated people with its warmth and mysterious inner glow. The Baltic coast has always been the primary and most reliable global source of this unique natural material. The Vikings quickly realized that collecting beautiful stones on the beach was far safer than hunting giant walruses, and these yellow stones could be sold for absolutely astronomical sums in the right markets. The amber trade required the Northerners to have a little understanding of foreign Eastern culture and the specific tastes of their customers. Arab buyers were very demanding regarding the perfect clarity and even color of the imported stone. The most prized was completely transparent amber without impurities, in which sunlight played beautifully. The Vikings carefully sorted their goods back home so as not to haul cheap junk thousands of kilometers. They operated like modern luxury car dealers, offering customers only the very best. To reach the wealthy Arab markets, the Scandinavians had to cross vast, wild territories. They sailed down the broad Volga River to the Caspian Sea, where they met merchants from all over the mysterious East. This was the so-called Volga trade route, no less important than the famous route to Byzantium. Here, they profitably exchanged their amber for the very thing that had prompted this deadly, dangerous venture. The main prize was tons of silver Arab dirhams, which literally flooded poor Scandinavia. Archaeologists today find these shiny coins by the thousands in Swedish soil. Imagine the colossal culture shock both sides experienced during this strange encounter. Tall, fair-haired people in heavy furs arrived in a hot climate carrying chunks of yellow resin. Arab diplomats, such as the educated Ibn Fadlan, left detailed descriptions of these strange northern merchants. They were horrified by their wild customs, but paid tribute to their iron business acumen and the quality of their goods. Business erased cultural boundaries far more effectively than any diplomacy, even the most sophisticated. The Baltic sun, in the form of polished yellow stones, found a permanent home in the chests of the Arab caliphs. This enduring trade bridge between the cold north and the hot east endured for several successful centuries, enriching both sides. The Vikings brought beauty to the south and, in return, took away hard, ringing currency and exotic spices. But amber was merely a harmless, beautiful part of their large-scale commercial activities. They had another highly sought-after commodity, the trade in which today inspires utter horror. And this specific commodity could speak, breathe, and feel unbearable pain. We have come to the darkest, yet economically most significant part of the entire Viking Age. This is something romantic films about brave and noble seafarers absolutely hate to go into detail about. A significant portion of the immense wealth of the northern kingdoms came from the massive and incredibly brutal slave trade. People were just as common a commodity as bone or fur, only they cost much more. This is a bitter historical truth, without which it is simply impossible to understand the financial mechanics of that world. The prices at the vast slave markets in Byzantium or Baghdad justified any logistical difficulties. A beautiful young woman could cost as much as a fine warhorse or an entire house. Skilled artisans who were taken captive were generally valued by buyers as highly as gold. The Vikings acted as ruthless, efficient middlemen, taking people in the west and selling them in the east. This well-oiled system ran like a Swiss watch for nearly 300 bloody years. Historical documents from that time are literally replete with references to this horrific trade. Islamic geographers coldly describe the Russ's ships, packed tightly with captive Slavs. Christian monks constantly wrote tearful letters pleading for their unfortunate brothers to be ransomed from slavery. Sometimes the Vikings deliberately captured noble, wealthy people solely to obtain a huge ransom. If the ransom was not paid on time, a proud lord could easily end up on a galley or in damp mines. In this trade, high status in the past meant nothing. What mattered was only the relative's ability to pay. Living cargo yielded colossal super profits, but the reputational and physical risks were enormous. Uprisings by desperate people on ships or escapes were a common occurrence, resulting in losses. Therefore, another, much calmer and more reliable type of business developed in parallel. It required absolutely no feeding of the cargo en route and did not attempt to slit your throat at night. We are talking about the fur trade, which was often and rightly called the black gold of the North. If you wanted to show everyone your high status in the 10th century, you needed the right clothes, and in a harsh world without central heating or synthetic fabrics, the best status was warmth and beauty. Sable, marten, fox, and beaver furs were the absolute, unattainable height of fashion among the global elite. The Vikings tightly controlled vast forested territories where this resource literally ran through the trees. They quickly turned the furs they harvested into one of their main and most expensive export commodities. Hunting for high-quality fur is not just a fun walk through the woods with a bow and arrows. It is an extremely complex process requiring perfect knowledge of animal behavior and the setting of cunning traps that do not damage the pelt. Hunters would venture deep into the taiga for months on end, living in damp dugouts in sub-zero temperatures. The skins had to be removed correctly and carefully, cleaned of fat and dried. Otherwise, they lost all value. The slightest mistake in processing, and a precious sable would turn into a piece of useless, rotting trash. This delicate craft required incredible patience and professionalism, passed down from father to son. The Vikings not only hunted themselves, but also systematically collected furs as tribute from local tribes. The system of forced tribute collection, known as polluti, was the foundation of the economy of early Kievan Rus. Heavily armed Varangian detachments rode through Slavic and Finno-Ugric settlements, seizing furs. It was state-sanctioned extortion, backed by sharp steel and demonstrative cruelty. If a tribe refused to pay this fur tribute, its village was simply burned to the ground. It is interesting to see how furs directly influence the monetary system of some remote regions. In places where there was a catastrophic shortage of silver coins, furs served as hard currency. This is where the names of early Slavic money came from: kunas, from the word for marten, or veksha, squirrel. People literally and routinely paid for food with pieces of well-tanned hides. The modern economy uses paper banknotes, but 1,000 years ago, they were replaced by a fluffy beaver tail. But the fur trade was a strictly seasonal business with very tight time frames. Hunting took place exclusively in winter, when the animals grew a thick and incredibly beautiful undercoat. In the spring, the goods were transported to the rivers and left there until the ice melted, allowing for the start of dangerous navigation. If a merchant was late for the start of the trading season in Byzantium, he could easily lose his entire profit. These logistics were so tightly tied to natural cycles that any unforeseen delay cost a fortune. The Vikings' time management was dictated not by a morning alarm clock, but by the melting of the ice on the river. Delivering furs required special, almost paranoid protection against water and dampness in the hold. The skins were tightly packed into special leather bags, generously soaked in fat to make them waterproof. If a freak wave swamped the ship and water reached the furs, the cargo had to be thrown overboard with tears in one's eyes. It was a constant source of stress. You were carrying a fortune that could be destroyed by a single small leak. Merchants were literally sitting on barrels of gunpowder. Only instead of gunpowder, it was wet, ruined sable. The fur trade became a powerful catalyst for the exploration of the vast, unexplored expanses of Eastern Europe. In search of new, rich hunting grounds, the Vikings ventured deeper and deeper into the dense forests, establishing trading posts. These small, fortified wooden strongholds eventually grew into large, bustling cities. The fur trade laid a solid economic foundation for the creation of new states on the world map, and this entire fur empire was built on a single incredible route, about which grim legends abound. It was a route that mercilessly shattered both men and ships.
It dances. It's a
If you want to truly understand the real scale of these people's endurance, look at their main route. The route from the Varangians to the Greeks is not a smooth, paved highway with gas stations and cozy motels. It is thousands of kilometers of unpredictable rivers, lakes, swamps, and grueling portages through wild terrain. The route began in Scandinavia, passing through the Gulf of Finland, the Neva, the Volkhov, the Lovat, and the mighty Dnieper. It sounds like a boring list of rivers from a geography textbook, but for the merchants, it was a deadly obstacle course. The most terrifying and exhausting ordeal along this route were the portages, the stretches of land between rivers. Ships had to be pulled out of the water and literally dragged across the ground on slippery wooden rollers. Imagine the weight of a massive oak vessel loaded with tons of amber, furs, and heavy supplies. My shoulders start to ache unbearably just from reading the dry descriptions of this process in the chronicles. People would strap themselves into harnesses and pull the ships through the mud under the shouts of the overseers. Modern CrossFit workouts involving dragging tires are child's play compared to a typical Tuesday for a Viking on a portage. During these overland journeys, merchants were most vulnerable to attacks by hostile local tribes. Bandits knew these narrow passages well and often set up ambushes in the dense forest. That is why a merchant caravan was always, at the same time, a well-armed, disciplined army. Some of the exhausted men hauled the ship, while others walked alongside with drawn swords and shields. Their harsh business plan included a mandatory clause: kill anyone who tries to take our cargo. But the real nightmare of the entire journey was the famous, impassable Dnieper Rapids. These are massive, jagged rock formations that block the river and create deadly, churning whirlpools. The Byzantine emperor, Constantine Porphyrogenitus, left a detailed, blood-curdling description of how the Rus overcame this obstacle. They navigated part of the rapids by rowing, maneuvering between the rocks at the risk of smashing the ship to pieces. The horror of the situation lay in the fact that the water here was churning, and the slightest mistake by the helmsman meant certain death. It was ancient whitewater rafting of the highest difficulty level, where life itself was at stake. It was absolutely physically impossible to navigate the most dangerous rapids by water under any circumstances. The crew had to disembark again and drag the heavy ship over sharp, slippery rocks. At this time, the Pechenegs, steppe nomads, often watched them closely from the high banks. They waited for the perfect moment when the merchants were exhausted from hard labor to rain a hail of arrows down on them. Defending themselves while carrying the ship on their shoulders was extremely difficult, so casualties were consistently high. To minimize risks, the Vikings banded together into huge, well-protected caravans of dozens of ships. The larger the flotilla, the less likely the nomads were to risk attacking it in the open. In the spring, the caravans gathered in Kiev, hired experienced pilots, and set off together for the perilous south. It was a mass migration of commerce that resembled a military operation more than ordinary trade. Discipline in such convoys was ironclad. Disobeying the commander's orders could easily result in being thrown overboard. The safety of the group was always prioritized over the comfort or life of an individual. Near Khortytsia Island, having navigated the rapids, the surviving merchants made bloody sacrifices to their gods as a sign of gratitude. They slaughtered roosters, stuck arrows into a massive oak tree, and prayed fervently to Odin or the thunderer Thor. After such immense stress, the people needed psychological relief and the belief that the worst was behind them. Archaeologists still find swords and anchors at the bottom of the Dnieper, lost in those terrifying whirlpools. These are silent witnesses to the fact that fickle fortune smiled on far from all participants in this regatta. When the ships finally reached the Black Sea, a new phase of trials began, the maritime one. Black Sea Drakers and Nors were built for the northern seas, but the Black Sea has its own harsh, treacherous nature. Storms here strike suddenly, and there is almost nowhere to take shelter along the flat, open shores. Merchants tried to stay close to the coastline so they could quickly beach their ships in case of danger. But on the beach, aggressive, armed locals might be waiting for them. It seemed as though the whole world was trying to prevent them from delivering their furs to the wealthy Byzantine markets. Their arrival in Constantinople was a triumph of survival and the beginning of a long, complex diplomatic process. Imperial officials strictly regulated the Rus' stay in the capital, fearing their savage nature. They were allowed to enter the city through only one gate, unarmed and in groups of 50. They were constantly watched to ensure that these peaceful merchants did not suddenly decide to plunder the rich palaces. They lived in a specially designated quarter outside the city's mighty walls. The route from the Varangians to the Greeks lasted for several centuries, fabulously enriching Northern Europe. It became a powerful cultural bridge through which Christianity, architecture, and writing came to the north. It was a highway that exchanged the bones of Greenland walruses for the refined Byzantine civilization. Those who traveled this route returned home as living legends with chests full of silk and silver. But for this mechanism to work, a very specific economic model was required, one in which blood was constantly mixed with profit. How did the mindset of a rugged Viking merchant actually work? Modern business people read smart books on risk management and draw fancy return on investment charts. 8th century Northerners simply grabbed an axe, loaded a ship, and sailed into the absolute unknown. Their economy was built on a very fine line between honest trade and outright plunder. They were absolute opportunists. If a city was well defended, they traded. If it was weak, they plundered. Every self-respecting merchant always carried small folding scales and a set of weights. This was the most important, sacred tool of the era, more important than any weapon, even the sharpest one. Silver coins were rarely counted individually. They were always carefully weighed. If change was needed, a coin was simply chopped into several small pieces with a chisel. This chopped metal is found in hoards throughout Europe in enormous, unimaginable quantities. The coinage system was crude, but it worked flawlessly from Ireland all the way to Baghdad. Trust in this harsh business was built exclusively on personal reputation and strong family ties.
The time has come,
No
my son.
contracts with seals,
Go
no
with
courts
courage.
to protect the rights of consumers or investors. If you cheated a partner, he could simply come at night and burn your house down with you inside. It was a very effective, albeit radical method of market regulation that eliminated fraud among one's own. The fear of blood feuds worked better than any modern corporate security service. Investments in expeditions were distributed among the entire community to minimize risks. Building a ship and purchasing goods cost a fortune, which rarely belonged to a single person. Neighbors, relatives, and leaders pooled their silver, raising the initial capital for the dangerous voyage. These were the first joint stock companies in history, where dividends were paid in Eastern silk and gold.
Excellent.
If a ship sank,
Feel the weeds.
everyone bore the losses, but no one was left
the
destitute
quality is
alone.
superb.
It was a brilliant risk-sharing system that modern venture startups still use today. Women played a huge, pivotal role in this economic system while the men were at sea. They ran the farms with an iron fist, managed local trade, and controlled the family finances. In Scandinavian society, women had the legal
cargo is
right to
nearly
divorce and take their share of the property. Archaeologists have found richly
must go,
furnished female
all of us.
graves containing scales and weights, which directly indicate their status as merchants. The Viking economy was surprisingly progressive for its harsh, patriarchal era. Knowledge of the markets was passed down by word of mouth during long, boisterous winter feasts. Returning from Constantinople, merchants would recount which goods were currently in high demand among the Greeks. This insider information was the key to the success of the next, even larger expedition. Whoever knew the demand could buy the right goods and make the maximum profit. It was the medieval equivalent of stock market reports, only in verse and accompanied by a harp. The information was worth no less than Baltic amber itself. I wonder how they dealt with the constant language barrier across the globe. Merchants created rudimentary dictionaries and actively used literate slaves as translators. Often they simply relied on universal sign language, showing the goods and weighing the silver right in front of the buyer. In trade, you don't need a deep knowledge of grammar. It's enough to understand numbers and the exchange rate. Money has always been the best, most convincing translator in any cultural dispute. Taxes and customs duties were another headache in this complex logistics operation. Every local prince along the river wanted his share of the pie for safe passage through his territory. The Vikings paid a tithe in furs or silver to avoid unnecessary bloody conflicts with local garrisons. Sometimes they entered the service of these princes, gaining the right to duty-free trade in the region. This was classic lobbying, a merger of business and power for mutual financial gain. Politics and economics always went hand in hand on these harsh northern rivers. It is important to understand that for a Scandinavian, accumulated wealth was not an end in itself. Silver and luxury were needed to elevate social status and distribute generous gifts. A chieftain who generously rewarded his people earned their absolute loyalty and support in battle. The economy was not geared toward the endless accumulation of capital, but toward the creation of strong, unbreakable social bonds. Greed was despised, while generosity was celebrated in the sagas as the highest virtue of a ruler. The outcome of this unique economic model is staggering in its scale. A handful of rugged farmers from a cold peninsula managed to integrate into the global trade network. They connected worlds that seemed incompatible: icy Greenland and the fiery East. Their scales determined the fates of entire states, and their axes defended this trade from any encroachments. But the most striking example of this integration was their encounter with the Islamic world in Baghdad. There, an unprecedented encounter took place that changed northern culture forever. 9th century Baghdad was the New York of the medieval world, a center of science, immense wealth, and trade. The city's population exceeded 1 million people, while London or Paris were merely large, dirty villages. The streets were neatly paved, lanterns burned at night, and the vast bazaars sold everything from spices to intricate astrolabes. And then, into this glittering metropolis arrived bearded men in heavy furs, smelling of campfires and the sea. The contrast between the refined East and the harsh North is impossible to describe in words. Islamic chroniclers have left us invaluable, highly detailed accounts of these encounters. They referred to the newcomers as Rus, and were genuinely astonished by their immense height and the eerie tattoos stretching from their fingers to their necks. The Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan met them in person on the Volga and was shocked by their concept of hygiene. He wrote that they were the filthiest creatures created by Allah, though he acknowledged their incredible physical strength. But despite the deep cultural divide, business was booming. The Rus brought what the Caliphate desperately needed: superb furs, slaves, and amber. In exchange, they received gleaming dirhams, silver coins of the highest purity. For the Scandinavians, the Arab dirham was a 100% guarantee of quality. These coins were neither counterfeited nor tampered with. They were so highly valued that the Vikings even made necklaces out of them to display their high status. Millions of these coins flowed north, becoming the lifeblood of the Scandinavian economy. It was the largest capital outflow from Asia to Europe at that time. In addition to silver, northern merchants purchased exotic goods that the North had never seen before. Silk, glass, spices, incense, and even peaches were shipped in the holds to the distant Baltic. Archaeologists find scraps of the finest Chinese silk in the graves of Viking chieftains in cold Sweden. Imagine a stern jarl in icy Scandinavia wearing a silk shirt with elegant Eastern patterns. This shatters all the stereotypes of wild barbarians in animal skins that pop culture has imposed on us. They loved refined luxury just as much as a good battle with axes. Weapons were also a vital import from the wealthy East. The famous Damascus blades were renowned for their incredible strength, flexibility, and sharpness. The Vikings eagerly traded their heavy, unwieldy swords for these masterpieces of blacksmithing. Finding a sword bearing the mark of an Eastern master was the cherished dream of any Scandinavian warrior. The quality of the steel directly and immediately affected one's chances of survival in battle, so they never skimped on weapons. Trade with the East required quick adaptation to the local rules of the game. The Scandinavians quickly realized that in Baghdad, one couldn't simply pull out an axe and take what was theirs by force. Here, strict laws, the Caliph's powerful standing army, and a complex, convoluted bureaucracy reigned. Merchants had to pay duties, hire local interpreters, and follow all market rules. They learned the art of diplomacy on the fly, transforming from pirates into respectable merchants. It wasn't the strongest man with an axe who survived, but the most flexible and adaptable. It is fascinating to trace the influence of this trade on the development of medicine in the far north. Along with spices, merchants brought Eastern medicinal ointments, herbs, and knowledge of advanced surgery. Arabic medicine was light years ahead of European medicine, and the Vikings held this in very high regard. They quickly adopted effective methods of treating wounds that saved lives after brutal battles. A pragmatic mind always takes what works,
Not enough.
regardless of the creator's religion. However,
It's all
this
I have.
golden age of trade with the vast
Then find
caliphate
more.
could not last forever.
The harvest was
By the
poor,
end of the
and
10th
coin is
century,
gone.
silver mines
What
in
shall
the
we do
east
to feed
began
our
to
families
rapidly
through the winter?
deplete. The flow of dirhams to the north began to dry up, causing a serious economic crisis in Scandinavia. The Vikings had to urgently seek new sources of income and refocus on Western Europe. They switched to English and German coins, completely changing the direction of their commercial expansion. The economy ruthlessly dictated policy, just as it does today. Nevertheless, an Eastern influence remained forever embedded in Scandinavian culture and art. Rings inscribed with the Arabic phrase, "For the sake of Allah," are regularly found in Swedish burial sites. This does not mean that the Vikings converted to Islam en masse. It was simply a beautiful status symbol exotic item. They absorbed elements of foreign cultures, creating their own unique melting pot in the cold north. And nowhere was this more vividly and extensively evident than in the capital of the Byzantine Empire. After the markets of Baghdad, Constantinople was the second main destination for the northern seafarers. But here, they were interested in more than just lucrative trade in goods or shiny silver. In Byzantium, they found a completely unique way to monetize their exceptional physical skills. They realized that their military art was also a commodity that could be sold for a very high price. And this commodity gave rise to the most famous military unit of the Middle Ages. We are talking about the elite guard that protected the emperors themselves. Constantinople, or Miklagard, as the Vikings respectfully called it, was the greatest city in the Christian world. The Byzantine emperors possessed untold riches, but they had one very serious chronic problem. They could trust no one in their own inner circle, where treacherous plots were constantly brewing. Ambitious local generals were constantly attempting to overthrow the ruler and seize the throne by force. The solution to this problem was found in the north, among the rugged men with massive axes. Emperor Basil II hired an entire contingent of Rus and Scandinavians as his personal, loyal guard. Thus, the famous Varangian Guard came into being, the true elite special forces of the Byzantine Empire. These men did not speak Greek, were not versed in the local toxic politics, and had no relatives here. Their iron loyalty was bought for vast sums of gold, and they were loyal only to whoever paid generously. It was an ideal arrangement. The emperor received a reliable human shield, and the mercenaries, fabulous wealth. Modern private military companies operate on exactly the same principle. The guard's main weapon was a heavy two-handed axe, which struck wild terror into the hearts of the empire's enemies. They stood unwaveringly on guard in the imperial chambers, gleaming in heavy armor and gold bracelets. The Byzantines called them barbarians wielding axes and preferred to give them a wide berth. In battle, the Varangians served as a devastating striking force capable of breaking through any defensive line. They never retreated, even in the most hopeless situations, valuing their contract above their own lives. Service in the Guard was a golden ticket to the big leagues for any Scandinavian warrior. Getting in was extremely difficult. It required excellent combat references and a demonstration of incredible strength. Over the years of service, a mercenary amassed a fortune that allowed him to return home a wealthy king. The most famous guard was Harald the Fierce, who later became King of Norway. He earned so much gold in Byzantium that he was able to finance a massive military campaign to seize the throne. It was the best investment of time and blood in the history of the Middle Ages. Interestingly, the guards had a strange official privilege following the death of their emperor. They had the legal right to enter the imperial treasury and take as much gold as they could carry. This ancient custom was called Paludisvarf and officially guaranteed them a massive severance bonus upon the end of their contract. Imagine modern bank guards being allowed to clean out the vault when the director changes. It sounds crazy, but it worked as excellent motivation to wait out their term of service without betraying their post. Life in the world's richest city profoundly and irrevocably changed these rugged northerners. They drank the finest wine, wore the finest silks, and relaxed in warm marble baths. Yet, they often left their graffiti on ancient architectural monuments. The famous runic inscription on a marble lion in Piraeus reads, "Harold carved these runes," or the inscriptions on the balustrade in Hagia Sophia, meaning Halfdan was here. This is classic medieval vandalism, showing that human nature hasn't changed at all over the millennia. The Varangian Guard existed for several centuries, outliving the Viking Age itself. Over time, the composition of the Guard changed slightly. Anglo-Saxons began to be recruited after the Norman conquest of England, but the original image of the bearded giant with an axe remained forever in Byzantine culture. This was yet another incredibly successful export from Scandinavia: professional loyalty. They sold their lives just as successfully as they sold furs or amber. Byzantium's influence on the mercenaries who returned home was immense and transformed the north. They brought home not only shiny coins but also new ideas about architecture, religion, and state governance. Christianity spread throughout Scandinavia largely through these wealthy, influential veterans. They built the first stone churches and attempted to introduce Roman laws into their wild lands. Cultural exchange always works both ways, even if it starts with a hired axe. This is a classic example of soft power winning over the hardened hearts of the invincible barbarians. The Varangian Guard perfectly illustrates just how complex and multifaceted the economy of that time was. You could be a simple farmer in Norway, then a walrus hunter, a merchant in Kiev, and end your life in the emperor's palace. Social mobility worked flawlessly, provided you had the courage to risk everything you had. No other culture of that time offered such incredible career opportunities to ordinary people. The sword and the axe opened doors that, by conventional means, would have taken generations to knock on. And therein lies the main secret of what we have come to call the Viking Age. It was a time of great, boundless opportunities for those who were not afraid of hard work and cold water. They created a global trade network from nothing, connecting distant continents, from the bones of Greenland walruses to the silks of Byzantine emperors. Everything was inextricably linked by their roots. And now, the time has come to take stock of this grand logistical empire that forever changed the map of the world.
Agreed.
The next time you see a Viking with a huge axe in a movie, think about the scales. These people forever transformed the global economy not because they enjoyed mindlessly raiding monasteries. They succeeded because they were the most resilient, shrewd, and daring merchants of their time. They embraced Christianity, mastered bureaucracy, and began minting their own coins based on the European model. This process of transformation demonstrates the incredible intelligence and pragmatism of Scandinavian society as a whole. They did not cling to the old ways if the new ones offered them greater profit and security. This is a brilliant lesson in adaptation, one that remains relevant in our rapidly changing world. Studying the past always provides us with surprising answers to the most complex challenges of the modern world. We proudly believe that we invented globalization, freelancing, and complex venture capital investment schemes just yesterday. In fact, all of this was conceived 1,000 years ago by people in leather sandals on the decks of wooden ships. The only difference lies in technology. Human nature and the laws of economics remain absolutely unchanged. Knowing history makes us wiser, allowing us to see patterns where others see only chaos. Thank you for traveling this long and incredibly dangerous trade route with me all the way to the end. We've examined in detail what the Vikings transported and why it was worth more than any silver. If you enjoyed this documentary journey down the rivers of time, stay with us for new dives into history. Ahead of us lies a vast array of mysteries, forgotten technologies, and incredible human stories. May your inner compass always guide you toward knowledge and new grand discoveries. See you on our next historical expeditions, where we'll once again unearth the truth hidden beneath layers of myth